Howdy folks, I'm the Partisan Ranger. Today we're talking about cavalry in modern warfare. This is actually seen as somewhat of a controversial topic, especially if you're on the side of the conversation that believes that cavalry still has a place in warfare to this very day. Now, it is a very reasonable assumption to make that cavalry has no place in warfare to this day because of the advancements of modern technology, and because, ultimately, that is the common belief. It is a very mainstream idea to consider cavalry entirely obsolete in warfare. And, ultimately, it is obsolete. But there are a great many tactics, strategies, and weapons that right now are obsolete and still very commonplace because of basic necessity. Now, usually I would try and more accurately illustrate my point, but really this is such a common idea. Cavalry's obsolete because of World War I, the Great War, machine guns, trenches, barbed wire. These things spelt out the death knell for the horse soldier. But that is actually an assumption that I believe is being made off of misinformation. Not inaccurate information, but misinformation. People are making an assumption utilizing a very unique case and applying it broadly. Now, what am I saying to back this up? Well, very simply, I'm actually using the writings of one George S. Patton to make this argument that cavalry still has a place in the world. More specifically, there is a book that you can buy right now called Cavalry and Tanks in Future Wars. It's a very short one. It's only like 86 or so pages. I picked my copy up on Amazon. But what they are is essentially a few reports, letters, and informational items that Patton, in his youth, wrote to the War Department defending the use of cavalry and, ultimately, tanks themselves. A rather unknown thing about the United States military is after both World Wars, it attempted to abandon any research and development into armored tank warfare. After the Great War, it was seen as just a product of its time that will never be used again by the United States military, and Patton attempted to defend its usefulness. But he also defended the use of cavalry. More precisely, he argued that cavalry, as long as it is able to outperform its contemporaries in every conceivable field, will always have a place in warfare. Now, from its core, the reason why cavalry was useful in Patton's day, and the reason why he argued that it would continue to be useful, was because of its superior mobility and ability to live off the land. Not just in utilizing them as forward scouts to gather information and to harass the enemy when found, but also to outmaneuver enemy positions, as well as to cut off lines of supply and communications. To this very day in warfare, those are all very key traits for any mobile force that wants to destroy enemy units and targets. But more specifically, in the actual engagement of the enemy, Patton notes that one singular advantage that an aggressive cavalry unit would have is the fact that it can move faster than any other unit around it. Now, of course, today, vehicles can easily outpace a horse. But just as true as it was 100 years ago, it is true today that there are always places that horses can go that a Jeep can't. Doesn't matter what kind of vehicle you're talking about. If you need to scale up a mountain or go down a 70-degree incline, a horse is going to be able to do that a lot easier than a Humvee. But about specifics. Now, in Patton's own writings, specifically about the Mexican campaigns, the punitive expedition into Mexico, where cavalry was actually still a very useful aspect. It was not wildly different from the Indian campaigns that had preceded it in the decades past. And What Patton noted was that because the cavalry was roughly being equipped with a similar set of weaponry as any infantry counterparts it might meet in the field, it possessed a roughly equal amount of firepower as whatever unit they're engaging. So, to put this in a modern context, any weapon an infantry platoon could be carrying with it, a cavalry unit could have as well. And in fact, the cavalry unit has the distinct advantage of being able to bring along pack mules to haul equipment that an infantry platoon might not be able to take with it, short of using vehicles. So a foot patrol that is actually out in the wilderness looking for a fight or looking for information will lack a set of weaponry that they can't really carry with them because it can't be packed onto their backs when they're already carrying half their own body weight and equipment. You could throw a javelin missile system on the back of a mule. You could throw an anti-tank gun on the back of a mule as long as you'd partially disassembled it. You could throw an M2 Browning 50 cal onto a back of a mule. I don't think a foot patrol is going to be dragging an M2 with them all the way through a desert. But let's get down to the real major reason why cavalry warfare was seen as obsolete to this very day, and that is the Great War. It is the de facto argument against the use of cavalry, but only the Western Front, which, mind you, everyone who talks about the Great War is usually talking about the Western Front and no other part of it. Cavalry was, functionally speaking, useless on the Western Front of the Great War. That was because fixed fortifications and machine guns make for very poor conditions for cavalry. But I would like to point out that even in that time period, the idea of commanding a unit of cavalrymen to charge across an open field, sabers glittering in the sun, was already considered kind of a tactically inept decision. So, while it did happen in the Western Front, it's mostly due to incompetent commanders, and not the actual failings of the units themselves. But the Western Front wasn't the only place where warfare was being conducted. On the Eastern Front, against the Russians, on the Ottoman Front, and on the African colonial front, cavalry was used not only to full effect and was exemplar in its performance, but it was utilizing traditional cavalry tactics against their enemies on all sides. And it begs the question, why is it that cavalry performed incredibly, or shall we say, for the sake of argument, it performed exactly the way it was expected to on the three other fronts of the war, but not on the Western Front? Now, obviously I already said, trench warfare had a major effect on it, but the reason why trench warfare was so effective and so possible, so widespread on the Western Front, rather than the entire war itself being embroiled in it, was a simple matter of infrastructure. Patton discusses this, in that Western Europe is decidedly a very unique region of the world because it possesses insane levels of mass production capabilities, incredible, well-maintained infrastructure, and nations whose governments are already used to having to mobilize a great many sections of their nation to support a war effort. So only in the Western Front was it possible for these nations to move the colossal amount of tonnage of artillery, ammunition, food, rifles, troops, horses, material of all sorts and makes into these regions. It effectively made an entire region of the world a funneling kill zone, simply because of the fact that they had the infrastructure that could support that level of a war machine. And so that is the reason why even in conflicts that have happened before and since the Great War that utilize trench warfare, not one of them have ever come close to the levels of devastation wrought by the First World War. And that is because they simply lacked the necessary infrastructure. And those regions of the world that the Great War took place in that did not have high levels of infrastructure, that did not have a massive industrial capacity or even large populations, cavalry was exactly as effective as it could be expected to be. There was no weapon that it could not bring with it wherever it decided to go. Light artillery designed to be pulled by horses for long-range patrols. It really is a hard thing to convey to people that our perceptions about why cavalry went out of fashion are entirely shaped by a singular, unique circumstance that has yet to truly be repeated before or since it's happened. Now, into a modern context, how would cavalry actually be used? Patton admittedly wrote his treatise on how he would use cavalry in future wars before the Second Great War had ever even happened. And by the time the Second World War happened and Patton was a general, the United States cavalry had effectively been hamstringed into irrelevance. As far as I'm aware, the only units of United States cavalry to see action did so in the Philippines, and seeing as how they were technically garrison units of the Philippines, they were actually utilizing outdated equipment against the Imperial Army of Japan. So, functionally speaking, the United States cavalry went into battle during the Second World War utilizing First World War equipment, and they performed exemplary. But they were missing one piece of equipment. In the years before the Second World War, the United States military effectively ended the use of its saber. The cavalry saber was rendered obsolete entirely in the eyes of the United States military, and so they were confiscated from the cavalry. Which meant that during the Second World War, the United States cavalry performed textbook cavalry charges against the Japanese, successfully broke through enemy lines, and routed entire units of the Imperial Army utilizing bayonets instead of sabers. Now, mind you, instead of revolvers, they were packing a 1911 pistol, so in terms of firepower per cavalryman, they were still doing relatively alright. But the Philippine campaigns are unfortunately the last great hurrah of the United States cavalry and its proper usage, seeing as how, though technically a cavalry unit saw action during the Korean War, it was bereft of its horses and launched as part of a amphibious assault force against the Korean Peninsula. So they fought as infantry the entire war. First they lost their sabers, then they lost their horses, and at that point they were no longer cavalrymen to begin with. Now, Patton suggests many things that would allow a cavalry unit to be effective, and interestingly, he does not say that they should be used to support tanks, because tanks are ultimately heavily restricted by supply lines. They must have a stable line of fuel and ammunition connecting between wherever they go and the rear lines. They cannot fight without ammo. They cannot move without gas. But a cavalry unit distinctly can operate without the aid of its compatriots. Cavalry units can live off the landscape, horses scrounging whatever they can eat, and men capturing weapons and supplies off of the enemy, and operating behind enemy lines in a capacity that cannot be replicated with infantry or armored forces. They can genuinely fight in conjunction with their comrades, or entirely separated from them, and still be an effective combat unit. And for this reason, hopefully, I will talk about this in much deeper length and more descriptive terms. Consider this an introduction. But for now, I've been the Partisan Ranger. I'll see you guys next time.